With that, let's get more on this whole situation. We're joined by Famke Krumbmüller, who's partner at OpenCitiz, which is a political risk consultancy. And as you'll see, Famke has a highly sharpened insight into all matters European. Thank you so much for being with us. As we saw from Alex's report, Macron and Merkel appear to get on extremely well. Do you think it really is such a harmonious relationship?
Let's say it's definitely much more harmonious than previous relationships. I mean, the Franco-German relationship is somewhat back on track, we could argue, because it has been a difficult relationship over the past years for many reasons, but mostly because of the disequilibrium between the two countries. So I think both sides are quite excited to have this relationship back and going.
So back on track. I mean, they differ on, I'm trying to think of things they differ on. They differ on nuclear power, because obviously Merkel wants to get rid of the nuclear power completely. France is chief exponent worldwide of nuclear technology. But is that about all they do disagree on? There must be other things, surely.
There are many things they disagree on. Cultures are very different, but that's also, to a certain extent, why you can argue if Germany and France manage to agree within the EU, that's mostly when you manage to take a leap forward in the EU, because the countries are quite different, and obviously because they're big member states, but also because they represent very different political cultures.
Does Brexit provide France and Germany with a big opportunity, do you think?
It does, to the extent that it pushes Europe and France and Germany back together. They have to stick together. It's one of the few things where all the member states could agree on a common plan how to deal with Brexit. So yes, it's definitely bringing countries in the EU much closer together on this one issue, and on other issues it has been complicated. So Brexit is a uniting factor to a certain extent.
I think you know where I'm going here, because obviously Macron has talked about a banking union being essential across the Eurozone, and obviously Britain was kind of on the edge of that and never really had both feet in the whole game, you might say. Could Germany cash in on the things that Britain might lose? You know, certain banks, certain financial services, those kind of things. Do you see that really happening?
I mean, Frankfurt and Berlin and Paris are really racing for the benefits of Brexit to that extent. These cities are really competing for relocation of headquarters and banks and sending staff to these countries. So there is a certain competition on that front trying to benefit from Brexit. There's also obviously a lot to lose. Certain countries in the EU are afraid of losing their liberal ally within the EU on certain matters. So it's not a clear win-win or lose-lose situation.
OK, but both they're sort of seemingly neck and neck, or that's how it looks anyway, because obviously if it's harmonious, then you think they're both getting on together. But I'm wondering if, given Angela Merkel's problems in getting her government sorted out, and given the time that took, and the fact that it is a very delicate coalition that she's now ruling over in Germany, and given the fact that Macron won with a landslide, does that give him the upper hand in any kind of talks that they're having? Does that give him more strength?
Difficult to argue. It depends what you're looking for, because you could also argue that Germany's economy at this stage is still doing better, and that's why they had the upper hand, if you want to call it like that, over the past few years. So it's difficult to really say there's someone who has the upper hand in this relationship, and it's probably a good thing if nobody really does. I think what Germany did is kind of maneuver themselves into a corner, because they've always been saying, oh, we'll talk about Eurozone reform once you've brought your deficit below the 3% mark and once you've done your reforms. And Macron, smart enough, understood this, has done all of this, and now Germany has to talk about Eurozone reforms. But obviously they still have the same reservations as before. And
of course Macron has a very clever financial brain, so this is something clearly that he has in mind. But on an issue sort of outside of the Franco-German couple, if you like, I mean, France taking lead role, for instance, in the Syria airstrikes recently. Is that an illustration of Macron maybe being the Euro leader rather than someone who is waiting for Merkel to agree and move together?
I mean, certainly on foreign policy, Germany is actually extremely happy for that to happen. They don't have a culture where they want to be adventurous on foreign policies, or they're extremely happy for a strong France who takes the lead, defends European interests, and then Merkel can just align and say, we agree, but we're actually not doing any airstrikes. So Germany is happy on that front, and from a much broader perspective, we've been talking a lot about dominant Germany in Europe and about Germany actually not really wanting to fulfill that position. Difficult to judge to what extent they do or they don't. But they are definitely genuinely happy about a stronger France.
Okay, so that suits Merkel. Okay. Thinking about the issues facing Macron here in France regarding the strikes that are going on, and obviously this is something that, you've obviously gone through the train system to get here or through the traffic and struggled to be here, and thank you for making it. And we're all living with it, and we're all either sympathising or not, and that's a different argument. But what Macron's dealing with is a kind of opening up to competition, if you like. They're not going to say privatisation, but effectively that's what it looks like. Opening up certain things to privatisation, in line, I suppose, with the increasing competition across Europe for things like rail.
Yes, I mean, to a certain extent, Macron is doing a lot of reforms that you could argue France should have been doing for many years, and they have always been difficult to push through. I mean, pension reforms, we've had several presidents try that and backtrack due to massive protests and strikes. It is a difficult country to reform, and as you mentioned, we can feel it right now. Again, it seems like everybody is on strike. And so what Macron is doing is pushing this through at the beginning of his mandate, hoping that he can capitalize on positive effects at the end of his mandate. He just needs to survive, let's say, the current phase. Okay,
so getting through that, and this, of course, is Emmanuel Macron's really big test. The big test for Merkel, in many ways, was, I suppose, the migrant crisis, wasn't it? What she faced. And obviously, do you think France is learning from Germany over that issue?
I mean, they could. The countries, it feeds back to what I was arguing at the beginning, that the countries do have different issues. And France obviously has also a very challenging situation with migrants, but it was much bigger in Germany as they received many more people. And it was extremely challenging and still is and will be for Merkel. From within her own party, there was much criticism, especially from the Bavarian sister party. From the Alternative for Germany, the far-right party that now for the first time sits in parliament. So she also had to deal with a lot of political pressures with regards to this extremely complicated issue.
So in terms of where that goes from there, I mean, clearly Merkel was damaged by that, damaged by the problems getting the government together, clear issue. France, though, of course, in its dealing with the migrants, the way it's reported in this country, you'd think France was absolutely overwhelmed by migrants. But, of course, as you pointed out, it took a lot less than Germany, a lot less than Sweden, certainly, and even fewer than Italy. Do you think maybe the way France is dealing with the migrant issue, there is some kind of lesson or coaching that Europe, Merkel, can offer to France in order to deal with it differently, deal with it better?
I mean, at the end of the day, I think what is the most valuable is European cooperation, countries that work together, that share the burden of migration arriving to Europe. And that has been extremely difficult, as we've seen many European discussions on this issue and a lot of disagreement, obviously, because a lot of funds are involved as well. And I think if you were able to do that a bit better, there would be more mutual learning.
Okay, if we were to do that a bit better, there'd be more mutual learning, which is a very good way of putting it. And I wonder whether that kind of cooperation is there, whether the leaders have that kind of flexibility to go there, to sort of learn from each other in that way. I mean, maybe these two possibly could. Do you think that's the case? Do you think they get on well enough to do that?
I'm sure they have the intelligence. I think the question is, can they politically afford it? And then can they publicly afford to do so?
Famke Krumbmüller, thank you very much for joining us. Partner at OpenCitiz, political risk consultancy, and as we heard, someone with a very keen insight into all matters European. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. We move on here live.